Welcome to the Stanford EE 380 colloquium on computer systems. Today, our speaker is Dave Rosenthal, who has spoken in several other times for us. And today he is going to talk about, can we mitigate the externalities of cryptocurrencies? In the run-up to the talk, Dave said, well, do I need to introduce myself or not? And I think he probably does. He knows more about what's going on these days than virtually anybody. So Dave, I'm going to let you take it from here, and you can respond to questions if we get them, and I'll see you at the other end. Okay.
Hey, thank you. So I apologize if this talk's a bit rough, because Dennis mailed me yesterday morning asking if I could speak. So I updated a talk I gave in December to an institutional investor conference. You don't need to take notes. The text of this talk with links to the sources and much additional material will be on blog.dshr.org. I'm aiming to talk for 30 minutes, which I realize is a bit short, but that's how long the talk I updated was, and be controversial enough to spark a discussion afterwards. So please hold questions until I'm done. So I'm David Rosenthal. I worked with James Gosling on CMU's Andrew project in the early 80s. I was a DE with him at Sun later in the 80s, working on Windows systems, including X and file systems. I quit to be employee number 4 at NVIDIA, where Curtis Preem and I did the basic IO architecture, and then was an early employee at Vitria, which was the second company of some founders of TIBCO. Before I start talking about cryptocurrencies, I should stress that I hold no long or short positions in cryptocurrencies, their derivatives, or related companies. I am long NVIDIA. Unlike most people discussing them, I'm not talking my book. So cryptocurrencies' roots lie deep in the libertarian culture of Silicon Valley and the cypherpunks. Libertarianism's attraction is based on ignoring externalities, and cryptocurrencies are no exception. Bitcoin is notorious for consuming as much electricity as the Netherlands, but there are around 10,000 other cryptocurrencies, most using similar infrastructure, and thus also in aggregate consuming unsustainable amounts of electricity. Bitcoin alone generates as much e-waste as the Netherlands. Cryptocurrencies suffer an epidemic of pump and dump schemes and wash trading. They enable a 5.2 billion a year ransomware industry. They have disrupted supply chains for GPUs, hard disks, SSDs, and other chips. They've made it impossible for web services to offer free tiers, and they're responsible for a massive crime wave, including fraud, theft, tax evasion, funding of rogue states such as North Korea, drug smuggling, and even as documented by Jameson Lopp's list of physical attacks, armed robbery, kidnapping, torture, and murder. The attempt to force El Salvador's population to use cryptocurrency is a fiasco. They offer no social benefit beyond speculation. Igor Makarov and Antoinette Schur write, 90% of the transaction volume on the Bitcoin blockchain is not tied to economically meaningful activities, but is the byproduct of the Bitcoin protocol design, as well as the preference of many participants for anonymity. Exchanges play a central role in the Bitcoin system. They explain 75% of real Bitcoin volume. Our results do not support the idea that the high valuation of cryptocurrencies is based on the demand for illegal transactions. Instead, they suggest that the majority of Bitcoin transactions is linked to speculation. Bitcoin is only processing around 27,000 economically meaningful transactions a day, and 75% of those are transactions between exchanges. So only 2.5% of the transactions are real blockchain-based transfers involving individuals. That's less than 5 a minute. Nakamoto's motivation for Bitcoin was distrust of institutions, especially central banks. When it launched in the early stage of the global financial crisis, this has had resonance. The key to a system that involves less trust is decentralization. So why do suspension bridges have stranded cables, not solid rods? The major reason is that solid rods would fail suddenly and catastrophically, whereas stranded cables fail slowly and make alarming noises while they do. We build software systems out of solid rods. They fail abruptly and completely. Most are designed to perform their tasks as fast as possible. So when they're compromised, they perform the attacker's tasks as fast as possible. Changing this, making systems that are resilient, ductile like copper and not brittle like glass, is an extraordinarily difficult problem in software engineering. Paul Vixie pointed out that rate limits are an essential part of the solution. I got interested in it when, burnt out after 3 startups, all of which IPO'd, I started work at the Stanford Library on the problem of keeping digital information safe for the long term. This work won my Stanford CS co-authors, Petros Maniatis, Mema Rousopoulos, TJ Gioli, and Professor Mary Baker, and I, a Best Paper Award at the 2003 SOSP for a decentralized consensus system using proof of work. When, 5 years later, Satoshi Nakamoto published the Bitcoin protocol, a cryptocurrency based on a decentralized consensus mechanism using proof of work, I was naturally interested in how it turned out. Decentralization is a necessary but insufficient requirement for system resilience. Centralized systems have a single locus of control. Subvert it and the system is at your mercy. It only took 6 years for Bitcoin to fail Nakamoto's goal of decentralization, with one mining pool controlling more than half the mining power. In the 7 years since, no more than 5 pools have always controlled a majority of the mining power. In 2014, I wrote Economies of Scale in Peer-to-Peer Networks, explaining the economic cause of this failure. Briefly, this is an example of the phenomenon described by W. Brian Arthur in 1994's Increasing Returns and Path Dependence in the Economy. Information technologies have strong economies of scale, so the larger the miner, the lower their costs, and thus the greater their profit, and thus the greater their market share. Blockchain is unfortunately a term used to describe 2 completely different technologies, which have in common only that they both use a Merkle tree data structure. Permissioned blockchains have a central authority controlling which network nodes can add blocks to the chain and are thus not decentralized, whereas permissionless blockchains such as Bitcoins do not. This difference is fundamental. Permissioned blockchains can use well-established and relatively efficient techniques such as Byzantine fault tolerance and thus don't have significant carbon footprints. These techniques ensure that each node in the network has performed the same computation on the same data to arrive at the same state for the next block in the chain. This is a consensus mechanism. In principle, each node in a permissionless blockchain's network can perform a different computation on different data to arrive at a different state for the next block in the chain. Which of these blocks ends up in the chain is determined by a randomized, biased election mechanism. For example, in proof of work blockchains such as Bitcoins, a node wins election by being the first to solve the puzzle. The length of time it takes to solve the puzzle is random, but the probability of being first is biased. It's proportional to the compute power the node uses. Initially, because of network latencies, nodes may disagree as to the next block in the chain, but eventually it will become clear which block gained the most acceptance among the nodes. This is why a Bitcoin transaction should not be regarded as final until it is 6 blocks from the head. Discussing blockchains and their externalities without specifying permissionless or permissioned is meaningless. They're completely different technologies. One is 30 years old, the other is 13 years old. Because there is no central authority controlling who can participate, decentralized consensus systems must defend against Sybil attacks, in which the attacker creates a majority of seemingly independent participants which are secretly under his control. The defense is to ensure that the reward for a successful Sybil attack is less than the cost of mounting it. Thus, participation in a permissionless blockchain must be expensive. So miners must be reimbursed for their costly efforts. There is no central authority capable of collecting funds from users and distributing them to the miners in proportion to these efforts. Thus, miners' reimbursement must be generated organically by the blockchain itself. A permissionless blockchain needs a cryptocurrency to be secure. Because miners' OPEX and CAPEX costs cannot be paid in the blockchain's cryptocurrency, exchanges are required to enable the rewards for mining to be converted into fiat currency to pay these costs. Someone needs to be on the other side of these sell orders. The only reason to be on the buy side of these orders is the belief that number go up. Thus, exchanges need to attract speculators in order to perform their function. Thus, a permissionless blockchain requires a cryptocurrency to function, and this cryptocurrency requires speculation to function. Why are economies of scale a fundamental problem for decentralized systems? Participation must be expensive, and so will be subject to economies of scale. They will drive the system to centralize. So the expenditure in attempting to ensure that the system is decentralized is a futile waste. Most cryptocurrencies impose these costs, as our earlier system did, using proof of work. It was a brilliant idea when Cynthia Dwork and Moni Nair originated it in 1992, being both simple and effective. But when it's required to make participation expensive enough for a $1 trillion cryptocurrency, it has an unsustainable carbon footprint. The leading source for estimating Bitcoin's electricity consumption is the Cambridge Bitcoin Energy Consumption Index, whose current central estimate is 117 terawatt hours a year. Adjusting Christian Stoll et al.'s 2018 estimate of Bitcoin's carbon footprint to the current CBECI estimate gives a range of about 40.4 to 125.7 megatons of CO2 per year for Bitcoin's OPEX emissions, or between Portugal and Myanmar. Unfortunately, this is likely to be a considerable underestimate. Bitcoin's growing e-waste problem by Alex de Vries and Christian Stoll concludes that Bitcoin's annual e-waste generation adds up to 30.7 metric kilotons as of May 2021. This level is comparable to the small IT equipment waste produced by a country such as the Netherlands. That is an average of one whole MacBook Air of e-waste per economically meaningful transaction. The reason for this extraordinary waste is that the profitability of mining depends on the energy consumed per hash, and the rapid development of mining ASICs means that they rapidly become uncompetitive. De Vries and Stoll estimate that the average service life is less than 16 months. This mountain of e-waste contains embedded carbon emissions from its manufacture, transport, and disposal. These graphs show that for Facebook and Google data centers, CapEx emissions are at least as great as the OPEX emissions. Cryptocurrencies assume that society is committed to this waste of energy and hardware forever. Their response is frantic greenwashing, such as claiming that because Bitcoin mining allows an obsolete, uncompetitive coal burning plant near St. Louis to continue burning coal, it's somehow good for the environment. But they argue mining can use renewable energy. First, at present it doesn't. For example, Luxfolio implemented their commitment to 100% renewable energy by buying 15 megawatts of coal-fired power from the Navajo Nation. Secondly, even if it were true that cryptocurrencies ran on renewable power, the idea that it's okay for speculation to waste vast amounts of renewable power assumes that doing so doesn't compete with more socially valuable uses for renewables, or indeed for power in general. Right now, the world is short of power. One major reason that China banned cryptocurrency mining was that they needed their limited supplies of power to keep factories running and homes warm. Shortage of energy is not a short-term problem. This graph is from peak oil and the Low Carbon Energy Transition, a Net Energy Perspective by Louis Delanoy et al., showing that as the easiest deposits are exploited first, the energy return on investment, measuring the fraction of the total energy delivered to consumers, decreases. Delanoy et al.'s figure 1 shows the gross and net oil energy history and projects it to 2050. The gross energy, and thus the carbon emission, peaks around 2035, but because the energy used in extraction, the top yellow band, increases rapidly, the net energy peaks in about 5 years. This is a problem for 2 reasons. If society is to survive, carbon emissions need to start decreasing now, not in a decade and a half, and renewables need to be deployed very rapidly. Deploying renewables consumes energy, which is paid back during their initial operation. Thus, the current transition to renewable power consumes energy, reducing that available for other uses. The world cannot afford to waste a Netherlands' worth of energy on speculation that could instead be deploying renewables. If cryptocurrency speculation is to continue, it needs to vastly reduce its carbon footprint by eliminating proof of work. The 2 major candidates are proof of space and time and proof of stake. Proof of stake and time attempts to make participation expensive by wasting storage instead of computation. The highest profile such effort is Bram Cohen's Chia, which he described in a 2018 EE380. It's funded by Andreessen Horowitz, the SoftBank of crypto. Chia's space farmers create and store plots consisting of large amounts of otherwise useless data. The software is ingenious, but the design suffered from naivete about storage media and markets. When it launched in May, gullible farmers rushed to buy hard disks and SSDs. By July, the capital tied up in farming hardware was around 6 times the market cap of the Chia coin. Chia's CEO described the result. We've kind of destroyed the short-term disk supply chain. Disk vendors were forced to explain that Chia farming voided the media's warranty. Just as with GPUs, the used market was flooded with burnt-out storage. Chia's coin initially traded at $1,934 before dropping more than 90%. Last I looked, it was $81. I expect A16Z made money, but everyone else had to deal with the costs. Chia doesn't use much electricity, more to do with failure than with the technology, but it does have a major e-waste problem. The costs that proof of stake imposes to make participation expensive are the risk of loss and the foregone liquidity of the stake, an escrowed amount of the cryptocurrency itself. This has 2 philosophical problems. It isn't just that the Gini coefficient of cryptocurrencies are extremely high, but the proof of stake makes this a self-reinforcing problem. Because the rewards for mining new blocks and the fees for including transactions in blocks flow to the holders in proportion to their holdings, whatever Gini coefficient the systems start out with will always increase. Proof of stake isn't effective at decentralization. And cryptocurrency whales are believers in number go up. The eventual progress of their coin to the moon means that the temporary costs of staking are irrelevant. There are also a host of severe technical problems. The accomplished Ethereum team have been making a praiseworthy effort to overcome them for more than 7 years and are still more than a year away from being able to migrate off proof of work. But Vitalik Buterin pointed out that lack of decentralization was a security risk in 2017, and this was amply borne out last year when Justin Sun conspired with 3 exchanges staking their customers' coins to take over the Steem proof-of-stake blockchain. Pushing back against the economic forces centralizing these systems is extremely difficult. The advantage of permissionless over permissioned blockchains is claimed to be decentralization. How has that worked out in practice? As has been true for the last 7 years, no more than 5 mining pools control the majority of the Bitcoin mining power. And last November, 2 poles controlled the majority of Ethereum mining. Makarov and Shur write, 6 out of the largest mining pools are registered in China and have strong ties to Bitmain Technologies, which is the largest producer of Bitcoin mining hardware. It isn't just the mining pools that are centralized. The top 10% of miners control 90%, and just 0.1%, about 50 miners, control close to 50% of mining capacity. This centralization doesn't just increase the system's technical risk, but also its legal risk. The reason is that in almost all cryptocurrencies, a transaction wishing to be confirmed is submitted to a public mempool of pending transactions. The mining pools choose transactions from there to include in the blocks they attempt to mine. This, as Nicholas Weaver points out, means that mining pools are providing money transmission services under US law. Thus, in the US, they are required to follow the anti-money laundering Know Your Customer AML KYC rules as enforced by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The only pool to try following them stopped doing this because the larger Bitcoin community objects to the idea of attempting to restrict Bitcoin to legal uses. As Adam F.A. Genser et al. Pointed out, a Byzantine quorum system of size 20 could achieve better decentralization than proof-of-work mining at a much lower resource cost. Thus, the only reason for the massive carbon footprint of proof-of-work and the complexity and risk of the alternatives is to maintain the illusion of decentralization. Alas, it's unlikely that any alternative defense against civil attacks will be widely enough adopted to mitigate proof-of-work's carbon emissions. Immutability is one of the 2 things that make the cryptocurrency crime wave so effective. These systems are brittle, make a single momentary mistake, and your assets are irretrievable. Immutability sounds like a great idea when everything's going to plan, but in the real world, mistakes are inevitable. Let's take a few recent examples. The $23 million fee Bitfinex paid for a $100,000 transaction, or the $19 million oopsie at Indexed Finance, or the $31 million oopsie at MonoX, or the $90 million oopsie at Compound, and the subsequent $67 million oopsie, all of which left the perpetrators pleading with the beneficiaries to return the loot. And in Compound's case, threatening its customers with the ultimate crypto punishment, reporting them to the IRS. $12 billion in DeFi theft so far, or about 5% of all the funds. Vulnerabilities are equally inevitable, as we see with the $38 million, $19 million, and $130 million hacks of Cream Finance last year, the $115 million hack of Badger DAO, the $196 million hack of Bitmark, the recent $323 million hack of Wormhole, and of course, the $600 million hack of Poly Network. Because Ethereum and similar cryptocurrencies are programming environments, their attack surface is much larger than Bitcoin's. Now that DeFi and NFT protocols are implemented as smart contracts in these environments, the attack surface has expanded much further. One example is the rash of hacks involving hijacks of the Discord servers of the communities surrounding them to lure victims into authenticating their wallets to malign smart contracts. Another is the flood of rug pulls buried in the smart contracts implementing NFTs. Yet another is described in Dan Goodin's How $323 Million in Crypto Was Stolen from a Blockchain Bridge Called Wormhole. Because there are many competing blockchains, bridges exist to provide liquidity between them. Last month, Vitalik Buterin provided a detailed explanation of why they are a fundamental security problem. A smart contract called a guardian locks up coins on one blockchain and unlocks the same number on another. But in this case, the guardian failed to properly validate signatures. 3 days later, a bug in another bridge was exploited for another $4.3 million. The centralization of Ethereum's mining pools and exchanges enabled Poly Network to persuade them to blacklist the addresses involved. This made it very difficult for the miscreant to escape with the loot, much of which was returned. But it also vividly demonstrated that in most blockchains, it's the mining pools that decide which transactions make it into a block and are thus executed. The small number of dominant mining pools can effectively prevent addresses from transacting and can prioritize transactions from favored addresses. They can also allow transactions to avoid the public mempool to prevent them being front-run by bots. This turned out to be useful when a small group of white hats discovered a vulnerability in a smart contract holding $9.6 million. The key point of escaping the dark forest, Samsung's account of their night's work, is that after the group spotted the vulnerability and built a transaction to rescue the funds, they could not put the rescue transaction in the public mempool because it would have been front-run by a bot. They had to find a miner who would put the transaction in a block without it appearing in the mempool. In other words, their transaction needed a dark pool, and they had to trust the cooperative miner not to front-run it. Ethereum is, fortunately, very far from decentralized, being centralized around a small number of large pools. Thus, the group needed a trusted pool, not an individual miner. At the time, the 3 largest pools mined more than half the blocks between them, so only 3 calls would have been needed to have a very good chance that the transaction would appear in one of the next few blocks. Most activity in, quote, trustless, unquote, cryptocurrencies actually uses trusted third parties, exchanges that are layered above the blockchain itself. These use conventional web-based identities and provide another layer of centralization. Binance, the dominant exchange, does 2 out of every 3 derivative transactions and half of all the spot transactions. Adam Levitin points out that customers are unsecured creditors of exchanges. Exchanges are routinely compromised. In most cases, immutability means the pilfered funds are not recovered. But more fundamentally, the entire cryptocurrency ecosystem depends upon a trusted third party, Tether, which acts as a central bank, issuing the stable coins that currencies are priced in and priced against and traded in. This is despite the fact that Tether is known to be untrustworthy, having consistently lied about its reserves. The other main enabler of the cryptocurrency crime spree is the prospect of transactions that aren't merely immutable, but are also anonymous. Anonymity for small transactions is important, but for large transactions, it provides the infrastructure for major crime. In the physical world, cash is anonymous, but it has the valuable property that the cost and difficulty of transacting increase strongly with size. KYC, AML, and other regulations leverage this. Cryptocurrencies lack this property. The ease with which cryptocurrency can be transferred between institutions that do and do not observe the KYC AML regulations means that absent robust action by the US, the KYC AML regime is doomed. The most serious crime enabled by anonymity is ransomware, which is regularly crippling essential infrastructure such as oil pipelines and hospital systems, to say nothing of the losses to businesses large and small. This business is estimated to gross $5.2 billion a year and is growing rapidly, aided by a network of specialist service providers. That's just the ransom payments. The actual externalities include the much larger costs of recovering from the attacks. There are cryptocurrencies that provide almost complete anonymity using sophisticated cryptography. For example, Monero. Observers cannot decipher addresses trading Monero, transaction amounts, address balances, or transaction histories. Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies are pseudonymous, not anonymous. Anyone can create and use an essentially unlimited number of pseudonyms, addresses, but transactions and balances using them are public. A newly minted pseudonym cannot be de-anonymized, but as it becomes enmeshed in the public web of transactions, Maintaining anonymity takes more operational security than most users can manage. Users are aware of the risk that their transactions can be traced, so many engage in wash transactions between addresses they control and use mixers and tumblers to mingle their coins with those of other miscreants. Because it's almost impossible to actually buy legal goods with Bitcoin, at some point a holder needs to use an exchange to obtain fiat currency. This risks having their identity connected into the web of transactions on the blockchain. Makarov and Shor conclude 90% of the transaction volume on the Bitcoin blockchain is not tied to economically meaningful activity, but is the byproduct of the Bitcoin protocol design, as well as the preference of many participants for anonymity. In other words, 90% of Bitcoin's carbon footprint is used in a partially successful attempt to compensate for its deficient anonymity. Because there are existing alternatives, such as Monero, that provide greatly increased anonymity, attempts to mitigate the externalities of pseudonymous cryptocurrencies are likely to be self-defeating. As the ransomware industry shows, users will migrate to these alternatives, reducing the effectiveness of chain analysis. Although the techniques used to implement decentralization are effective in theory, at scale, emergent economic effects render them ineffective. Despite this, decentralization is fundamental to the cryptocurrency ideology, making mitigation of its externalities effectively impossible. And attempts to mitigate the externalities of pseudonymous cryptocurrencies are likely to be self-defeating. We can conclude, first, permissioned blockchains do not need a cryptocurrency to defend against civil attacks, and thus do not have significant externalities. Permissionless blockchains require a cryptocurrency and thus necessarily impose all the externalities I've described, except the carbon footprint. If successful, permissionless blockchains using proof of work or any other way to waste a real resource as a civil defense have unacceptable carbon footprints. Whatever civil defense they use, economics forces successful permissionless blockchains to centralize. There is no justification for wasting resources in a doomed attempt at decentralization. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of centralization. I started building a decentralized permissionless system almost a quarter century ago. It would be wonderful if we could figure out how to build a web that would resist centralization. But all the technical and financial cleverness that's been poured into cryptocurrencies hasn't succeeded in doing that. Why? It's because it isn't about the technology. I'm a big believer in Bill Joy's law of startups. Success is inversely proportional to the amount of money you have. For $2.5 million, we got NVIDIA to working silicon that was revolutionary in two different respects. Right now, there is way too much money. If a system is to be decentralized, it has to have a low barrier to entry. If it has a low barrier to entry, competition will ensure that it has low margins. Low margin businesses don't attract venture capital. VCs are pouring money into cryptocurrency and Web3 companies. This money is not going to build systems with low barriers to entry and thus low margins. Thus, the systems that will result from this flood of money will not be decentralized, no matter what the sales pitch says. Despite all the cleverness and hype, the technology just isn't that good. It's both extraordinarily inefficient and extraordinarily insecure. Nicholas Weaver points out that the Ethereum computer is 1/5000th as powerful as a Raspberry Pi, and that for the cost of 1 second of its use, you can buy nearly 60 Raspberry Pis. Moxie Marlinspike exploits the fact that an NFT is a link to a file of metadata that links to the image it purports to represent. So neither is guaranteed to exist or be valid. You have only to glance at Molly White's Web3 is going just great timeline to wonder why anyone thinks this wretched hive of scum and villainy should be the future of the web. I hope I've said enough to start some discussion. I think there are three basic lines of argument. You could argue that the externalities I described don't exist. You'll have a hard time proving that the waste of electricity and hardware and the crime wave are imaginary. You could argue that although the externalities do exist, the benefits of decentralization outweigh them. The problem here is that since the systems are not actually decentralized, we get the externalities, but don't get the benefits. Or you could argue that although the externalities do exist and the systems aren't decentralized, they're making so much money that we shouldn't worry. The problem here is that the amount of actual money you can get out of a cryptocurrency equals the amount of actual money that has been put in, minus the actual costs of mining. So the big picture is that although there may be winners, in aggregate, the system loses money. So that's my brief talk, and let's have some discussion.
Yeah, so Mark Miller and a company he helped found called Agoric has made the point that these cryptocurrencies form a machine that can't be corrupted the way the hardware of our individual machines can be. No supply chain attacks, no hardware attacks like Rowhammer and things like that. And so they now have, albeit a very slow, they have an incorruptible machine. What's your comment on that?
Well, I think that's bullshit. Firstly, these things all run the same software. So you can mount a software supply chain attack against them. And building a computer that runs 1/5000th as fast as a Raspberry Pi is not a great help to the world. Okay, so it's impossible for services to create a free tier. Anything that on the web that's accessible, that's free, that can run a program will be exploited to mine cryptocurrencies. JavaScript, anything. Yes, if I'm aware of the Ethereum R&D Discord, I don't track it closely. The history is that the timeline for Ethereum to migrate to proof of stake has consistently slipped. And their predictions that it's a year away have always been delayed. Now, it's true that they do actually have the test blockchain running, but they haven't finished the software. And the part that they haven't finished looks to me to be one of the most difficult parts. But in any case, proof of stake is just a way of making sure that a system is controlled by a small number of insiders. And so I don't, I just don't think it's a good idea. What we see with Ethereum and similar programming environments is that they are a magnet for crime. Because it sounds like you have pervasive problems with the governance models of cryptocurrencies. Well, yes. The whole pitch is that these things are decentralized and democratic and controlled by their community and so on. And that is, in practice, just not true. Because, right, I mean, yes, says the code is the law unless one of the key stakeholders ox was gored. Well, yes, we've seen that several times, most notably with the Ethereum fork after the DAO was exploited. But actually, it's there are several examples. Oh, and as regards proof of stake, I think that the Steam example is worth noticing. Exchanges typically are allowed to stake their customers' coins. This is certainly true for Coinbase, and I'm pretty sure it's true for Binance. And what that means is that essentially Binance and a small number of other exchanges can outvote anybody on proof of stake blockchains, unless somehow the ability to stake their customers' coins is taken away. Yes, proof of stake is difficult. Yeah, I mean, I have to hand it to the Ethereum people. They have been taking a very, very serious approach to trying to implement proof of stake properly. And the fact that it's taken them 7 years and they're not done is an illustration of just how hard it is. And one might think that basing the second largest cryptocurrency on a technology that is that hard to get right would be rather a big risk. Okay, so what do I think of Filecoin and IPFS? Well, I'm very skeptical. I wrote about this a long time ago. I'm very skeptical about the economics of Filecoin. IPFS is, I mean, a decentralized content addressed file system is a great idea, but people don't understand how IPFS works. They assume that if you put something into IPFS, it's out there forever. But actually it isn't, unless you pay rent to a pinning service to keep a copy of it somewhere on IPFS, because otherwise it will eventually get kicked out of the caches. Yes, Definity has a consensus mechanism that randomly chooses a subset to vote on for the next block. Yep, so does Avalanche. And I think that's a great idea, because that's one of the ideas behind the LOX protocol. Randomly choosing a subset of your electorate to vote definitely makes it much harder for the attacker to attack the system, because they need to guess right about what the subset of the electorate is. And for details about why this is a great idea, you can look at our SOSP paper or the expanded version that was in Transactions on Computing Systems. I'm working on a blog post about Avalanche, which is mostly about why randomization is a good idea. Randomization, it's so people tend to think that because Byzantine fault tolerance is one of the really strong results in CS, that that fault tolerance is a determinate situation, but it's not. What Byzantine fault tolerance says is that the system's okay unless you have, if you have 3 F+1 replicas, the system's okay unless you have more than F failures. And the question is, what's the probability that the system in the real world will encounter more than F failures? So it's probabilistic, and so is so is the kind of the kind of consensus system behind locks and avalanche and Definity. Okay. What else?
Dave, do you think we're working on the right problem here? You know, we use the coin structure and currency to do stuff other than transfer money around, presumably. Maybe there's a better way to do the thing that we need as opposed to the way we're doing it.
Okay, so I mean, the question I'd ask is, what's the problem you're trying to solve?
And I'm getting there.
Yeah, and typically, the answer that you get from the cryptocurrency world or the decentralized systems world is that they're trying to deal with the fact that the web we have is dominated by a small number of large companies. And what we see is that systems based around cryptocurrencies are dominated by a small number of large companies. So if that was the problem you're trying to solve, you have definitively failed. Now, possibly there was some other problem you were trying to solve that you just didn't tell me about, but the one you told me about, you have failed to solve. And this isn't something new. You failed to solve it 7 years ago. And despite all the gaslighting since, you haven't succeeded in recovering from that failure.
So you see the blockchain as something better than a totally distributed mechanism for taking a series of events and applying a partial ordering to them?
So the Federal Reserve and MIT have a project called Project Hamilton, which is building the infrastructure for central bank cryptocurrencies, stable coins. And they've just released a report which says that one of their 2 prototype systems has sustained 1.7 million transactions a second with finality in less than 2 seconds, and has done that despite 2 of its data centers failing simultaneously. So centralized blockchain-based systems, permission blockchain-based systems can be extremely powerful. Decentralized ones cannot be extremely powerful because they have the overhead of defending against civil attacks. And they have a much worse synchronization problem.
Well, I was called upon to look at NFTs a little bit a while back, and I really would appreciate it if you told me a little bit about it. I don't see any value to them. So
an NFT is a smart contract on one of these programmable blockchains, typically Ethereum or Solana, and it arranges that there's only one instance of it, but because it's extremely expensive to take up a lot of space in blockchain, you can't actually put the image that or whatever it is that you're NFTing into the blockchain itself. What's in the blockchain is a link, which is typically a link to a file full of metadata, a small file full of metadata. It's a URL for this small file full of metadata. And in the file full of metadata is a link to the actual image, which is also a URL. So I spent nearly 2 decades working on web archiving. And one of the very first observations about the dynamic behavior of the web at scale was that URLs go 404, link rot. And subsequent research showed that they also suffer from content drift. In other words, the same URL resolves at a later time to different content. And NFTs have both of those problems. Now, you can mitigate them by ensuring that both the metadata file and the image itself are in, for example, IPFS. But if you do that, you have to keep paying rent in order to maintain these files in IPFS. This isn't really what people think of when they think of NFTs.
Why does an NFT command such a very high price when it offers no value?
Well, because the world is full of scammers. Basically, the people who thought up the idea of NFTs were artists, and they thought up this idea hoping with the goal of getting more of the value of their work to artists. But because this thing is based on cryptocurrencies, what they ended up doing was enabling scammers. And what we see at the moment, for example, is that there are bots going around and scraping collections of images and minting NFTs for them completely without permission from the artists who created the images. It's down to the artists to complain about this to OpenSea and have OpenSea, which is the centralized market for these things, blacklist them. And so instead of, the other thing is that you mentioned the very high values put on these things. One of the interesting things about the entire cryptocurrency world is that almost every single number describing it is wildly exaggerated. We saw in my talk that the transaction rate is wildly exaggerated. The market cap of cryptocurrencies is wildly exaggerated because you can't get that much money out. If you did, you would crash the value. And we saw that, what was it, about 6 months ago? Someone crashed the value of Bitcoin 10% by selling 150 of them. What else? I mean, the values of NFTs are entirely due to the fact that almost every NFT is wash traded. We have, today, we had the wonderful example of Ivanka Trump's NFTs. Was it Ivanka or Melania? I can't remember. Anyway, I think it was Melania. Anyway, they had a NFT of her hat, an image of her hat, which they wanted to sell for $250,000, but they launched the sale while the value of the cryptocurrencies was going down, and somebody took a look at the blockchain and worked out that what had happened was that they had given whatever it was, 1,800 sols from the Solana blockchain to somebody who bought the NFT, and then the money went right back where it came from, which is a little suspicious. And I have a blog post about somebody who wash traded an NFT for $500 million, and could do this because of DeFi. They could do a flash loan where you borrow cryptocurrency and do something and then pay the cryptocurrency back. And all of that is bundled into a single transaction. And sure, you pay a little bit of money for the interest for this fraction of a second, but you have it. So they borrowed $500 million, wash traded an NFT, paid the $500 million back, and then listed the NFT for over $1 billion. These numbers are just completely incredible.
I quite agree. Are there other questions out there?
I'm sorry that my talk was considerably shorter than the typical E380 one, but it was the result of hurried updating of a talk which had a hard half-hour limit on it, and I didn't have time to expand it all that much. And as I say,
it was an awesome talk, and Paul's right. It was an awesome talk.
Like all my talks, it'll be up on blog.dshr.org, so you can follow the links and get the sources for all my outrageous claims. Yes, the wash trading NFT one. If you look on my blog for a post called "Number Go Up," making sure that number go up, you'll find the story of the $500 million NFT. And I gotta say, being skeptical about this world is really a whole lot of fun. Oh, and if you want to have more about this, the Economist has a podcast called Babbage about technology. And the one that they just put up features a number of luminaries like Tim O'Reilly and so on, and me, talking about Web3. And the first part of this podcast is a whole lot of Web3 people emitting this awesome tsunami of hype about what Web3 is going to do for the world, which of course all happens because it's decentralized. And then it has Tim and me and some Economist editors pouring cold water on this. So you'll find that in the comments on my blog, but you can just look for Economist Babbage and you'll find the podcast. Okay. Well, thanks so much for the invitation, Dennis. I find that talking about this stuff is really fun.
It's amazing, and the folks out there on the comments coming up on the screen were just very useful.
Yeah.
I think it's time we let you go.
Okay.
It's sort of that time, but thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next meeting, I guess.